Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about movements and initiatives that seek to move humanity to its next epochal iteration. This podcast is brought to you by Witlingo. When it comes to managing a community, one of the keys to success is the ability to effectively communicate with the members of that community. If you are a service coordinator or responsible for community engagement, Witlingo provides a multi-channel, multilingual notification and engagement platform to help you work more efficiently and effectively. For more information, please visit www.witlingo.com. That's www.witlingo.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid.
But you're right. I mean, it's a phenomenon that if we were to sort of make the case that half of the country feels abandoned and feels not heard and feels stigmatized and so on, and if you were to sort of like just make that point, I think the best way to make that point is to pick up the worst possible politician or human being, almost, in terms of his moral and all that, so that
Yes.
it's not him. It's not him. It is it's the feeling, right? It's all he has to do is the system is bad, and then all these people saying yes, and then the fact that he is, he does not respect norms, that he does not respect process, or does not respect protocol. All of that makes it even more appealing, which is, I find stunning that those folks who don't want him to be elected, in fact, point out those things that are attractive, that make him attractive to his base, and they keep doing it. Like you take somebody like Rachel Maddow from MSNBC. I don't know if you guys are sort of aware of those shows, but there is MSNBC, it's on the left, and you have like these big shows, and they have these very loyal audiences for years and years now, since 2016. Every single show is about how outrageous, right, Donald Trump is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's appealing for their audience, fine. But you're not going to win anyone that way. I don't know if they care at all, right? You are only going to enhance him. So this right now, going after him, he's a convicted felon now. It makes him even more, right? He is against the law, right? Now he's lawless. He's a lawless person. And there's voters out there who have never voted who are going to go out and vote for him. And so it's sort of, this is sort of a little bit amazing that and so how does one explain that? How does one explain this sort of lack of intelligence or strategy, or to be honest with you?
Well, because I don't think, to be honest, that the establishment Democrats. I've lived a lot of my life in America, so I do NBCs and these kinds of things. So I did my PhD in New York. But
you did? Okay.
The key thing, I think, from the establishment Democrat point of view, and I think it's true in there's a similar kind of phenomenon in the United Kingdom and in Australia with their respective Labor parties, that winning the election is not their main concern. That's not really going to affect their interests very much. Their real interests lie elsewhere, and the real interests lie in making sure that essentially foreign policy and macroeconomic policy remain untouched. And the striking thing about the Trump presidency, and indeed the Obama presidency before that, was that both of those things remained essentially untouched throughout the entire period. The things that really mattered, there was an awful lot of sound and noise about cultural issues and personality issues. But the things that really matter in terms of policy, which is people's livelihoods, economic policy, and the empire, foreign policy, remained essentially untouched. I mean, the very minor things around the edges, but I mean, all the stuff, of course, Trump spoke about in the lead up to the 2016 election. He was going to, get rid of NATO or at least stop it from expanding. That didn't happen. He was going to drain the flood and get rid of the Goldman Sachs, and then he appointed a Goldman Sachs figure as Treasury Secretary. Oh yes, and he thought WikiLeaks were, he loved WikiLeaks, and then he initiated prosecution, the current prosecution of Julian Assange. So, anyone who believes anything he says about any topic at all, yes, is.
So one could accuse you and I right now of indulging in a conspiracy theory about how, there is this cabal, whatever, behind the scenes. The politicians are just there for show to make it look like there is democracy and there's debate. There's even like folks saying, and I dismiss nothing now. I listen and I try to make sense of things. For example, DEI, diversity. What is this? What does it stand for? Equity, whatever, right? That whole movement started around the time 2011, 12, right? And now people are divided about those issues, which are not essential issues. They are not what most people care about. They're important, of course, right? But they are not what people care about. Like, they care about not having to work 3 jobs and not having insurance and being 1 paycheck away from a catastrophe or 1 bad diagnosis away from a catastrophe. Those are the things that this nation is rich enough to take care of swiftly, right? Very swiftly, right? And so how would you and I, if somebody came in, I don't know, somebody from CNN who gets paid nicely and likes the narrative, and he's dismissing us, how do we counter that? How would we say, listen, this is not far-fetched. In fact, this explains a lot more things than this saves more phenomena than your theory. How would we go about like countering that person or that voice effectively, so that somebody who is a thinking person would say, these 2 guys are not that crazy by saying.
Well, I don't know that you and I can do this on our own, but I think enough people, and I think there are growing numbers of people who are thinking that way, and I think especially young people. So, who knows what the future will bring, but I do think that I have great hopes in the current generation. They're often sneered at by our generation, but our generation, I take it you're roughly on the same page there.
Absolutely.
Have treated them abominably in every single way. I think it's happening everywhere, that loading them with unbelievable debt,
destroying the environment.
Destroying their environment, making housing unaffordable, and those things being driven home. Look, you'll never persuade the CNN, still less the Fox journalist, that the things they're so head up about aren't the real issues. But those people will die out or retire, and they'll be replaced by, I think
that's the only way. I think you're right.
I think they'll be replaced by better people in the coming decades. But yes, I'd like it to be happening a lot quicker, to be honest.
Well, the thing is the following. I think what's been happening in all these campuses, I don't know about you, but I'm heartened, number 1, but number 2, I am really surprised by number 1, their commitment, right? They've been at it for a while now. It's not like bad, right? Even the riots, I don't call them riots, the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, they were, I don't know, summer, and that was it. I think it was a few months, and then, but this one seems to be sustained, number 1. But number 2, they seem to be informed in a very fundamental way that this is a clash between the establishment. It's not just Gaza and genocide. It is definitely a visceral, hugely emotional, energizing issue for sure. But I think they understand that it's a tip of a whole iceberg that got us to the point, right? And I'm impressed by that. I'm impressed by that for number 1, how much we underestimated them. We thought like these are the people who have the iPhone stuck to their hand, and they watch YouTube and they watch Instagram and they watch
Yeah.
TikTok, and they are brainless and so forth. You know, and yet here they are, the beacon, I think, or the hope. I agree with you.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I've got an encampment at my own university, University of Tasmania, and they're just beautiful, brave people. I wish more of my colleagues were supporting them. I mean, I think, you know, when you talk about how to fight back, I don't think there's certainly not in America, any immediate hope in the electoral system, certainly not in the presidential election, maybe at other levels, but there's all kinds of, you know, your political influence shouldn't, I mean, too many people, I think that their political influence begins and ends with their casting of the vote. It should go a lot further than that. And, you know, on the Gaza issue, I see, you know, unions taking action, waterfront workers refusing to load weapons, more and more universities divesting from Israel or imposing academic boycotts. And yes, I think there's a very fundamental change going on. And it seems so glaring that you know, the point I made before about establishment Democrats not really caring about winning the election. They've got other priorities that, you know, Biden seems to have quite chosen to lose the election for the sake of Bibi Netanyahu, which is an extraordinary thing, but it seems to actually have,
so how they would accuse us of, because I cannot explain all of his actions. Every single action seems like he's trying to lose.
Yeah.
His stuff. So
well, he just doesn't seem to
explain that
care.
without sounding conspiratorial? How can one?
No, well, I think yes, absolutely sound conspiratorial, because I think there are conspiracies going on very clearly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, those. The thing is that it's well known that Democrats raised a whole lot of money and gained seats during Trump, the Trump years. You know, they won every election, every 2018, 2020, 2022, because the shadow was still there. I think 2024. I think they're like, okay, things. I don't know. So now I'm gonna delve into my conspiracy theory. Okay, so meaning that like we are going. I mean. All hell is going to break loose, right? We don't want to be under that watch. Let Trump be under the watch of when things go wrong, right? And then we will, as a result of that, we will the 2026 and then 2024, 2026, 2028, right? Is the presidentials. Between now and then, the system would have been in such a shambles that they would. So for me, that makes more sense than saying, well, Biden is trying very hard, and the people are not.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it seems to me unreasonable to say that the people don't know they are wrong about the economy.
Yes.
It's like, it's just false consciousness. You should know that you're doing well. What are you talking about? I have 3 jobs.
Yeah.
And they keep saying this. Go on. I'm sorry.
And that's another thing that's particularly impressive about the student things is student encampments is that these are people who are working really long hours as well as being students as well, and they're
absolutely
digging into their time, and they're raising the consciousness, and
and so I mean
where they get the time or energy.
Well, they're young, so that makes a difference.
That helps.
I have one of those. He's 22-year-old, and I look at him and how he can move around and do things and all that. It's like, wow, I used to be like that once.
Yeah.
I wish I had.
I have a 21-year-old too. So.
Okay, so we're on the same boat. So let me. I'm going to play, just sort of to drive the point home. I'm gonna play a video. Okay, I'm gonna try to share it here, and then when we will edit it, and it will come out nice. So I'm going to see if I can share a screen, because I want you to see this video.
Do you think Russia's behind the sabotage of the pipelines?
Well, I think all the signs point to some type of sabotage. These pipelines are only in about 200 feet or so of water, and Russia does have an undersea capability that would easily lay explosive devices by those pipelines. And I do think it's a signal to Europe that Russia can reach beyond Ukraine's borders. So who knows what he might be planning next? But I think this is clearly an act of sabotage of some sort, and Russia is certainly the most likely suspect.
Why blow up their own pipelines if they can obviously just cut off the gas flowing from them?
Well, there's been no gas flowing through those pipelines, although there's some gas that's been pent up in them. That's why we've had the methane release. But there's also pipelines that are going into Europe that are bringing gas from Norway. And so it won't take much if Russia decides to go after the other pipelines that are bringing gas into Europe. So I think this might be, again, a sign that Russia is intent on doing whatever it believes it needs to do in order to weaken a European resolve. But I think this might be just the first salvo of some additional things that might be coming toward Europe.
Okay. Now, you tell me this guy clearly knew he was lying.
Yes,
right?
I think
He's
so.
a former CIA guy, right? And it's on the record, it's recorded. It wasn't a long time ago, right? I mean, you were saying at the beginning, you know, we discovered the conspiracy way long. The guy is still there. He's still being invited, and this lady is still doing her thing, right? And we all know that all he said was wrong, was false, and was a lie. And so the question then is, how come zero accountability at all? Is it because? Tell me.
Why is there zero accountability? Well, I mean, there is okay. Obviously, he's lying. This idea that Russia blew up their own pipeline is just crazy, and he didn't answer the question. That should be glaringly obvious. Obviously, he's appealing to a segment of the population who are heavily indoctrinated. I think that would be, you know, those who are still supporting Biden, who are, you know, really there, but they're increasingly small part of the population. But yes, the links between the major media networks and well, not just the CIA, but the whole deep state are well established. You know, merely lying, you know, we know that has no consequences at all for the most part in American media. The Iraq invasion of 2003, we saw numerous lies from not only public officials but by their media hacks.
New York Times.
And they're apart from, you know, one person being sacked from the New York Times, nothing really. Indeed, the only people who really lost their jobs in the media were the critics of the war, in much greater numbers. So, you know, the links between establishment media and the security state, the deep state, very long-standing, and their links not only of financial interests, but also they're all friends, they're congenial, they go to the same clubs, and so on. So
they have the annual the White House funds dinner where they come in gala and all that, which is, and the one thing I liked about I liked nothing about the Trump president except for one, is that he just didn't attend any of those, right?
Yes, no, absolutely, and you can see, of course, why that appeals to people, and people on CNN get worked up about it, and that just enhances his appeal. And I think, you know, two things which very much appealed to him. One was the contempt which he held the establishment media, which he still holds the establishment media in, which is widely and rightly shared by large segments of the population, probably the majority of the population.
Absolutely.
And also his, you know, there was a lot of fuss made about the fact that he didn't believe his own security assessments about various matters. He didn't believe the NSA and the CIA about various things, or said he didn't. And, you know, everyone knows these people are liars. Everyone knows, you know,
they are professionals.
But if their lips are moving, they're lying, and it's supposed to be some outrage that the president doesn't believe them.
Amazing. Well, I think the price they're paying, I mean, these legacy media are shrinking. fast. Young people don't want. I think there was an interesting graphic early, I think in November 2023, that showed a very clear correlation between, where do you consume your media and where do you stand on Ukraine, where do you stand on Palestine, where do you stand? And clearly the young people who are like at 25% watching mainstream media and getting all the news from somewhere else, they had the very polar opposite opinion of folks who are older, who watched basically, who didn't do any Instagram. They watched, just sat down, watched the nightly news, and they watched the shows, and they basically got the same story again and again, just reaffirmed. So I think their punishment is their shrinkage, right? They're going to shrink out of, and they're going to die off, right? Because now it's not easy anymore to just lie, just like this guy did, right? This clip here is very popular in Twitter and all that. It comes up all the time, right? And so these are data points that are reinforcing the notion that do not trust the establishment, and hence I think what we're seeing now with labor, young people, and the encampments and so forth.
Well, one of the things that it makes it particularly obvious the propagandist nature of this stuff is that they're not making profits, yet they continue to exist. So you've got to ask, why do presumably canny business people who own these things keep them going even though they're losing money? The answer is, of course, they're trying to influence opinion. They're trying, and to some extent successfully, especially with the older people who are still in power. Rupert Murdoch has a newspaper in Australia called The Australian, which has been running for over 40 years now, and it's always lost money ever since it's existed. But since it's the only national newspaper, daily newspaper in the country, he keeps it going. It loses about $100 million a year now, and he keeps it going because it's influential. It's read by politicians. It's read by people in establishment clubs and businessmen and so on. So,
it's a marketing spend in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so the last thing I want to talk to you about is, so right now I am working with a couple of colleagues on just so we chose one person in let's call it independent media, right? And his name is Jimmy. And Jimmy Dore is a comedian, but he is he's in the, you've seen him?
I think I've heard of him, but I don't know him. No.
So we picked him to just go deep into, because he's accused of being conspiracy theorist, right? So I watched his show the last 6 months. Clearly, he's not what he is. He is just not challenges the narrative, right? But if you go to the page, or when they talk about him, they just cast him as this lunatic. Clearly, he's not a lunatic, and so we're trying to figure out to explain why they have been going after him, and he doesn't have a massive audience, and yet the establishment is after him. And then the question is interesting about sort of going deep into this guy and his story for the last 4 years or so, because my question, or the thing that we're trying to understand is, okay, so clearly the old way of doing things, the old way of maintaining consent about the certain narrative is crumbling, right? Number one. Number two, these moneyed interests are not just going to just give up and throw up their hands. They are going to continue to fight, right? What in your opinion, or how, if you were to say, okay, no, they're trying to ban Instagram, the legal system is such that it's not going to happen probably for a while. It's going to be appeals. It's not going to happen tomorrow or this year, or even next year. It's going to take a while. If it is going, so that's one attempt. If these guys are going to come at this, these independent media, these voices who are not following the narrative, and even though they are islands, they are very effective. And I think the encampment movement is proof. And I think they are panicking about that because they're seeing that the challenge is real. The challenge is informed. Challenge is from young people. These are people who are going to take power soon. In 5-10 years, they'll be in position of power, and so they'll make decisions and so on. And so, how are they going to strategize their way into neutralizing if they can? Or do you think it's a hopeless? Maybe that's why you're optimistic. Maybe you think it's a
no, but I hope. I mean, nothing's inevitable, I think, but clearly, yes, the managers of the US empire in particular are in a mode of desperation. They do rely on a wide degree of consent. How much consent they need to retain power is unclear, I think. In the United States, because I think, despite its boast, it's not a particularly democratic place. And I don't think it's pretty clear that they don't need the consent of the majority, because the majority, for the most part, don't even vote, so they're not consenting. But they do need a consent of a large part at the moment of the middle class. I think there's in the United States, this is certain part of the mainstream narrative is that everyone's middle class, except maybe Bruce Springsteen. The concept of the working class is very much being pushed aside. You won't hear politicians there appealing to the working class. It's always middle class.
Right.
I think, the effort's always got to be about raising consciousness. And I think in America in particular, the convincing people that they're not middle class.
Yeah.
People who are deeply in debt, who are in major financial problem, who can't afford to go to the doctor, are not middle class, who work for a living. They're working class people. And I think at least part of what's got to happen is people have to recognize, regain class consciousness and establish solidarity amongst their peers. And I think that's got to be the first step. Whether that happens or not is hard to say. But I think as the younger generation come up and they don't have the same wealth that their parents had, still less their grandparents, and they see that they're being lied to increasingly, and that I think there's hope for that still. But yes, it's a dangerous time, because I think increasingly the ruling class in America especially, but here too, are becoming more and more desperate and more violent and more willing to do whatever it takes. So it's dangerous, but that very violence is going to increase anger against them, as it should.
Is there anything to learn from what happened after the 60s? So the 60s were all about radical change, and the driver there was the Vietnam War, and then and then Watergate came somewhere in there, and right, and yet all of that energy sort of dissipated. Go ahead.
It dissipated, I think, in that case, because those people were not. Those people still had expectations of living affluent life that their parents had, indeed being more affluent. And
it's a middle class then, that's true.
They achieved that. I think the big difference now is that's no longer the case.
Okay.
And that's why I don't think, yes, you're absolutely right. In the 60s, it all dissipated, and all the people who were protesting the Vietnam War and marching for civil rights ended up voting for Reagan. I don't see that happening again, because I just don't, apart from the fact Reagan's dead, but I don't see anything like that happening again.
I think the issues are just too radically disrupting of folks' lives. Just the environment by itself, right, is going to be a huge thing.
Indeed, yeah.
The economic divide is so massive that it's ridiculous right now, right? Also, this, the United States is emptying its treasure on all these bases out there, 850 bases, right? And then they just had Normandy celebrations, and the irony there is that you have all these homeless veterans out there, right, that can be very quickly taken care of with a few $1 billion, right, set aside. It should be like the moonshot. No veteran should be homeless ever, hungry, right? They could do that, but they won't, right? And I think it's becoming just glaring. The promise, number one, the promise. Number two, the potential, because this is not an unwealthy nation, right? It's a wealthy nation, right? And then the problems, right? So I tell you what, Professor,
Just the other irony, I think, of the Normandy celebrations, I was saying that they hadn't invited any representative from Russia to them. And the whole thing took place as if the Russians had no role in that victory. Yes.
Yeah. And the Prime Minister of Britain, took off after, noon. You saw that, right?
No, I didn't see that.
He left early. He left early so that his Foreign Minister David Cameron took the big portrait at the end of the day with the president's and then this is a major. He just apologized this morning, and so he's in studio as a result of that. All right, so it just shows you that, Russia 20 million, right? Did they lose 20 million in World War?
I believe that's right. Yeah,
without them, there definitely would have not been a win for sure. And yet here we are, right? Okay. Well, Professor Coady, David Coady, thank you so much for making the time. This was a very interesting.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I've been interested too.
Lovely conversation. We'll definitely list several of the articles that I read from you about the topic. And then, do you have a more recent book than the one you published in 20?
Well, I have a book called. Well, I've got a few books out there. More recent than that. But
what's the most recent published?
Well, most recent book I published was on climate change, actually, with a colleague of mine, Richard Coady. But I've edited it a lot, but sole authored one. I've got a book called What to Believe Now, which is might be of interest to you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.